discuss the state of community radio in Canada and South Africa. Let us start with an overview, the current state of community in both countries, how it has evolved over the years.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today. Really appreciate it to be able to have the chance. So, community radio in Canada got started quite a long time. We've had stations on the air for over 100 years now, and there's been a lot of changes. Licensing sort of adjusted and was specifically designated to campus and community radio stations in the early 80s, with a lot of campus stations starting up. Since then, we've seen a strong growth of community radio stations. A lot of those stations are because there's just nothing else that's in those types of communities, whether large commercial radio has never made it there, or the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation just doesn't have the resources to be able to reach these small towns. So we've seen a lot of growth, around 5% new stations over the past 5 to 7 years. So it is really growing, and it's really becoming very critical.
Okay, Mr. Rooke, are there any differences in the regulation framework and the licensing process for the community radio between Canada and South Africa?
So in general, the regulatory framework and licensing processes between Canada and South Africa are pretty close. Both you have to have not-for-profit ownership. Both you have to be licensed by their regulators. Here it's called the CRTC, or the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, who has a bunch of commissioners and staff that work with legislation as well as all sorts of other areas. And both really have a similar focus and requirement to be on local information and news. And that's really what we're about, is that local element.
Fundamental issue. Let's take a look. Funding is essential for the sustainability of community radio. How do community radio stations in each country secure funding, and what challenges do they face in this regard?
So in Canada, there is no core funding. That's something that we're really trying to focus on. And we expect there to see a lot of success if we're able to do that. There's some funding through what's called the Community Radio Fund of Canada. That's an organization that the three associations here in Canada helped to set up to make possible so that radio stations could get some small project-based funding. But we are actively involved in trying to get additional support from the government. There is some provincial funding in a couple of spaces, specifically the province of Quebec, and that's focused around language because Quebec is a French language community. And then there are some local supports that radio stations are able to get, often from emergency services, the universities or the colleges if they're attached to a campus, and that type of thing. And then there's all the usual things that the radio stations do, things like advertising, funding, membership drive, and events. So there's a variety of different ways in which these stations are able to get funding. And of course, with the pandemic, with all these different challenges that have been happening in place, there's no real stable and core process. And that's what we're really hoping we'll see changed here in Canada in the next year or so.
How do community radio stations in Canada and South Africa cater for diversity, including indigenous population and ethnic minority, Mr. Rooke?
So these stations are incredibly important when it comes to diverse communities, Indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities. It's their role. It's written into the regulations. It's written into their license. It's in the bylaws. It's in the mandate of these stations. It's what these communities are actively looking for. So they know what that goal is of the station, which is to try to connect communities together and share stories. It's not to make money for someone sitting in a castle somewhere, raking in all the dough that from the hard work that people have put out. The design of community radio means that what goes into the station goes back into the station and the community. So it's a really different space to be in. And it's really that space for people to work together and showcase their own culture. And that's just incredibly important when it comes to communities all over the world.
Technology has transformed the media landscape. How are the community radio stations embracing digital advancement and engaging with their audience through an online platform?
Technology has really transformed the media landscape of late. I like to just simply say that radio is one form of communication. Our stations are now taking steps beyond simply broadcasting radio. They all have archives, they all have online streams. Most of them have apps. A lot of them have interactive phone opportunities or online communities that they share and work with. Many stations are providing supplemental information through podcastings or news portal or blog posts. So radio is really just one form of communication that people are working with to reach their audience. They're using so many different tools now, and it's not just step behind the mic and go. You have to know how to be able to promote and share the information, capture content, whether it's where you're getting your news and information, where the music's coming from. It all is intertwined together in the way that technology is used nowadays. And really happy to say that our sector tends to be often ones that pushes the boundary and takes leadership in finding better and more productive ways to connect with their listeners.
In your experience, Barry, what are some of the most successful community radio initiatives that have made a positive impact on their local communities in both countries?
So there's a lot of really important, successful community initiatives that radio have had. I'm going to give you a couple examples. So Vibe 105 is a radio station at York University in Toronto. It caters to a Black community, and it's really the only urban alternative radio station, not only in Toronto, a city of 5 million people, but across the country. A handful of years ago, they made the decision to rebrand and refocus, taking radio away from the center of their program and making it community-based focused. And that's really been what's been successful. And there's now twice as many programmers, 3 or 4 times more staff, and they touch so many other parts of the different communities because of it. Some other examples, CKOA and CKVB in Cape Breton and in Newfoundland had coverage of Hurricane Fiona. They were on the air while the hurricane was going through, providing information up to 3-4 days afterwards with town officials and when it was safe to come out of people's homes and where they could go for food. Incredibly important information that just nobody else was able to provide and get that information out with power being down in so many spaces. CFIS is in Prince George, BC. They're dealing with some of the worst, if not the worst, fire season ever. And they're actively covering local fires for emergency news and evacuation information. So really, again, super critical to the importance of the local community. And then other stations, Met Radio in Toronto has worked with refugees coming into town and providing opportunities for them to not only share news and information in their own language, but also to be able to connect and learn more about the country that they're now brought into. So very valuable in its own way as well. And I could spend another 20 minutes talking about different experiences across different spaces. But, community radio has that impact wherever it is around the world.
Community radio is known for its community-driven content. How do this station involve their listeners in a content creation and decision-making process?
So community-driven content is very important for community radio, whether it's on the campus or Indigenous radio as well. A lot of the stations are heavily involved in programming in the sense that if you'd like to become a programmer, they will train you. You don't need any experience. You can go into a station and they'll go through a formalized training process to get you on the air or to be helping with some sort of other format of program on the air. Other listeners can also be involved in decision-making by joining the board of directors. Each radio station is required to have a board of directors in order to guide and create governance plans where the station is going in the future. Most of the time, stations have paid staff, but sometimes they don't. Other options to be involved are things like joining a committee or promoting and being involved with local events. So there's plenty of opportunities to be involved, putting content on the air and putting the governance forward in the radio stations themselves.
Canada and South Africa have unique cultural landscape. How does community radio reflect and perceive the cultural heritage of each country?
So the community radio side of things is really about culture. It's really about heritage. It's about showing information and sharing stories and capturing ideas and presenting them in a way that anybody can receive it, accessible, free. You just need a radio and a little bit of power, whether that's from a battery or plugged in, and you can get a chance to be able to connect with those cultures that you haven't. It's really critical that these stations provide that opportunity and that voice. And it is one of the ways in which heritage is able to be shared across the countries, whether it's here in Canada or South Africa or again around the world.
What are the key challenges faced by community radio stations in Canada and South Africa, and how can these challenges be addressed to ensure their sustainability and growth, Mr. Rooke?
So there's a lot of challenges, especially when it comes to stability and growth. Capacity in our sector is probably the biggest challenge. That comes in the loss of volunteership. We're seeing about 40% loss of volunteers at radio stations since the pandemic started. So these stations are struggling to find people to come in and do a lot of the work that they had done before, whether that was on the air or helping with admin or running events or whatnot. So there is that loss of volunteership, and staffing has remained the same. So the staff are doing more with less. There is a need for government to be involved in, especially government funding. We've been asking the government to set up a $25 million a year fund to help provide core and stable funding. We've been asking for extensions for what we call the Local Journalism Initiative, which is hiring journalists and bringing them into the stations. That program is at the end of a very successful 5-year pilot project, and we're really excited to see that be extended and made permanent. So there's that challenge there. And then of late, we've been seeing challenges with major tech companies, groups like Google and Meta, who have been challenging and removing access to information that's being shared by these radio stations, and saying, well, our government has said they need to participate in the creation of programming in order, because they benefit from getting all of that news as well. So they're now fighting back about it. And what that means is that key ways in which people were able to share that information with their local communities, like Facebook, like Instagram, are being blocked. And this is one of the big challenges that is happening right now, and has the big problem of pulling people away from what they do, which is provide news and information. And they're being forced to worry about these other types of things that are a little outside of their control, but have huge impacts as well. So we hope to see some of those changes happen. And this is sort of a leadership process as well. We've seen Australia go through this battle. Canada is sort of now the next step on the fight for control of who allows people to see what and when and how. And these big tech giants are something that governments across the world are going to have to figure out how to address their impacts on their citizens and what it does for changing and challenging culture, media, access to information, growth and stability. Thank you so much again for having me on. It's been a pleasure to be able to chat. And if you'd like to learn more information, I'm at ncra.ca, and you can email barry@ncra.ca as well. Thanks again.
Barry Rooke from Canada, the gentleman that we have been working together for a very, very long time. Thank you very much, and for sharing a very wonderful information with us in relation to the state of community radio in Canada and South Africa. It has been wonderful information and helpful. I think viewers will be happy, and then would want to get more from that side of the world, because I understand you guys have more than we do in South Africa. 100 years of an existence for community radio. Thank you very much, Mr. Rooke.